When you entered an ancient Roman home, you often found yourself walking beneath a tintinnabulum, a bronze phallus, hanging from the rafters above you with little bells hanging from it tinkling like a wind chime, or staring into the face of a Gorgon head as you slid open the door. As you entered the home, you might be greeted by a mosaic of Medusa, glaring up at you from the floor with her stony gaze, and as you walked past the threshold, you might find yourself greeted by a fresco of the absurdly well-endowed god Priapus. The reflection of Narcissus's gaze might flash at you from the painted pond over the shoulder of Narcissus as he gazes at himself. The children of the house would have a phallus hung around the neck, and older inhabitants might be wearing amulets. All these disparate things are connected conceptually, and they're more than mere decoration. They're part of the ritualized protection of the home, and part of a much broader ritualistic belief system that was so prevalent in Roman culture. It characterized the way much of the material remains of the ancient Roman world look to us today. And more than that, it characterized so much of how ancient people in that world actually thought, behaved, and interacted. The focus of our attention in this episode is therefore on a belief and worldview that was so deeply ingrained in Roman culture that it manifested everywhere, from historical political decisions to domestic artistic choices. It is the Roman version of what we call the evil eye. We've spent the past few episodes exploring the religion of the Roman home, and we've looked at deities who were guardians and protectors, as well as forces to be placated and attended to. In the previous episode, we also looked at the lemures, who were what we might call ghosts or poltergeists. We saw that the lemures were something to be warded off rather than welcomed or worshipped in a home, and we also saw how beliefs about these spirits tapped into larger visions of the underworld, the afterlife, and the connection between the living and the dead. I noted the thin line between religion and superstition, and also the grey area beyond which acceptable religious ritual segues into untoward magical practices, and this fraught terrain of aversion and superstition is very much the same territory of Roman conceptualizations of the evil eye. This is not a deity in the sense of the other gods and goddesses of this series, but it was a belief that straddled religion and superstition in a manner so prevalent and so culturally entrenched that it deserves its own episode if we're to remain true to our ultimate aim of arriving at a better, fuller, and more nuanced understanding of the pantheon of Rome and the religion that fueled an empire. Belief in and superstitions about the evil eye are in fact still with us in the modern Mediterranean, and this may actually be the most tenacious of all the beliefs of the ancient world. It still hangs on, and in your travels you come across it regularly. It reveals itself in the paraphernalia you see dangling from garden trees, doorways, and taxi dashboards, as well as in jewellery, in furtive glances over the shoulder at compliments, and in phrases muttered to turn away that dreaded glare. Nevertheless, for all its longevity, its presence in the ancient Roman world is usually poorly explained and often misrepresented, and so we will rectify that now by turning our own gaze upon that which was once so universally avoided. Let us rub our eyes, spit into the folds of our own clothes, and enter the realm of Invidia. Invidia lives in a cave at the far reaches of the world where the sun never shines. Her dreaded abode is black, eternally gloomy and forever cold. She is inside eating the flesh of snakes, moving slowly with crooked teeth, slavering and venomous. She is pale and lanky with terrible bloodshot eyes flitting left and right. She breathes pestilence and decay. She smiles only when others weep, and sorrows and pines away when they are joyful and fortunate. Who is this dreadful being? Who is Invidia? In a word, she is envy. Envy of the worst kind, toxic and gnawing. She is mean-spirited and harmful. Once she infects a person with her black poison, they groan and wither, their fortunes and health fade, they're tormented and waste away. They lose whatever it is they had that had caused envy in the first place, whether that be beauty, wealth, success, or good fortune. So perhaps you can already see that this is not a moral tale. Although Christianity took on invidia as one of the deadly sins and thus made a moral out of it, what I'm describing is not a punishment for those who feel envy. It's not suffering on account of being a mean and jealous person. Rather, it's the demise and dreaded fate of those who fall victim to the gaze of jealous people. The crucial factor is the eyes. This is a malicious way of seeing. Invidia is all about vision and harm. The word and the name invidia comes from the Latin invidere. Now, video and videre means simply to look or to see, but invidere means to look against, to look maliciously in the sense of this maleficent gaze. And bizarrely, this is where the tech giant Nvidia took their name from, and I can only think that they didn't do enough research when coming up with it and took their information from the ill-informed nonsense that floats around the internet. I don't know what they think this name invokes. Presumably they thought that it meant that the company inspires jealousy among their competitors, or that it connotes something worthy of envy. Maybe someone out there knows why they called themselves that, and I'll be grateful to learn about it in the comments. But in any case, unless you have other ideas, you'll understand by the end of this episode just how badly they got it wrong. There's nothing about the whole world of Invidia that is anything remotely close to something you would like to associate yourself with in any way. In some regards, though, depending on where the world of AI takes us in the future, it might just end up being apt, but for all the wrong reasons. If, for example, the gaze of artificial intelligence turns upon us all and the technology ends up being a force for destruction and ruin, then the name will prove unfortunately justified. But I don't suppose the company will find much consolation in that. Otherwise, it's just a dreadful name to adopt. Invidia is a way of looking that is active and injurious. It's not simply a look that is expressive of envy. It is envy. Not an emotion, but a palpable thing, a corrosive process. The object of that gaze becomes its victim. And here I don't mean that the person is simply resented. Victims are literally poisoned by being looked at in this way. And to understand how this worked, we need to understand how vision was understood in the ancient world. Vision in general was understood as an active process by which the eye emitted rays or streams that interacted with objects. It's called extramission theory. Seeing was understood to occur by the emission of these visual rays, which streamed out into the external world, and they touched and captured whatever the gaze fell upon. So the eye, and the person it belonged to, actively projected something into the world rather than passively receiving light from it. Under normal circumstances, this was fine, but where Invidia had infected the gaze, these visual rays were noxious, and if they fell upon a person, they could take hold of them and contaminate them. The invidious person's feelings of resentment or jealousy were thus transmitted to the person or object being looked at, And this could cause real damage, whether physical, spiritual, or social. Physical harm could manifest as sickness, bad luck, or injury, which the Romans regularly attributed to the ill effects of an invidious gaze. Spiritual harm could manifest in the deflection of prosperity or the corruption of virtue, and social harm could undermine status and public reputation. So you see, the power of invidia was that of a dangerous force that could actively affect someone through visual contact. It wasn't so much a feeling or emotion as a toxic process, and it could happen entirely inadvertently. It's not as though envious people were imagined doing this to each other on purpose. It was simply the inevitable mechanics of envy at work. But nor was it an ordinary, natural sort of a process. Invidia was a kind of enchantment, but one in the realm of witchcraft and magic rather than divinity and religion. And that's why her personification was of an old hag and wicked witch-like form rather than a goddess. And that's important because it's often said that she's the Roman counterpart to the Greek goddess Nemesis, which is just patently untrue. Nemesis was a goddess for a start, and she was an avenging deity who meted out divine justice and revenge. And she was worshipped in Rome too under the same name. Nemesis was understandably a favorite among gladiators, and she had altars and amphitheaters, and gladiatorial armor often bore her griffins on it as protection. Nemesis was often depicted a beautiful young woman like all goddesses, and she often stood with the wheel of fate, which turned in time, symbolizing justice served. As a goddess, Nemesis had temples, cultic worship, and all the attentions to be expected of a deity. It should already be clear that this is absolutely nothing like Invidia, as I've presented her. The two domains overlapped in places. Nemesis delivered the vengeance of the gods, and this was sometimes a jealous sort of justice, when mortals rose too high, became too hubristic, and tread on the toes of the gods, or made boastful claims in that direction. It was Nemesis who brought about their downfall and destruction. So it's divine envy that she serves in this case. But as such, she's a corrective force who upholds the balance and proper order of things. Invidia was none of this. No known dedications, altars, or sanctuaries to Invidia exist. She was a force for ill and not a goddess. She was a pervasive, malign force endowed with supernatural traits. She's conspicuously absent from religious calendars, and there's no visual iconography of Invidia per se. What we have is an abundance of charms and images that are defensive against her, not representations of her. And I say her in terms of her personification, but like many of the Roman gods we've looked at, she was not necessarily or always conceived of in human form. What she did, though, took hold of human bodies physically and sometimes lethally. Hers was a dangerous enchantment, a fascination in the true sense of the word. So when you say in English that you're fascinated by something, you tend to mean that you find that thing really interesting. But when you say you're fascinated by someone, you might simply mean that you find that person interesting, but you also mean that you find them captivating in some way. Perhaps you are attracted to them somehow, and you find yourself under their spell. And this is the origin of the word fascinate. It comes from the Latin fascinare, which means to cause or to make the evil eye, to enchant or to bewitch. So fascination in this sense is the operative force of envy and the danger that invidia brings. Those who were fascinated were in trouble. It's as if a hex had been put upon them, just as the personified black hag moves slowly in her dark, sunless cave, so does her poison act slowly in those who have been contaminated. It isn't like a punishing flash of a thunderbolt. It is a slow withering away, sickness, a string of bad luck, a loss of good looks. Nevertheless, although the unravelling of the outcome was an extended process, this could be set in motion in an instant, in the flash of an eye. And it was these instants, these fleeting moments of eye contact that was so feared. One mythological character who will be familiar to you might nevertheless surprise you in being an archetypal victim of fascination. This is Narcissus, who fell so in love, so they say, with his own reflection that he couldn't drag himself away from the edge of the pool where he first saw it. Narcissus is often held up as a story warning against vanity or self-absorption, which works fine at the superficial level of moral examples. In fact, however, this is a story about the evil eye. Narcissus embodies auto-fascination, meaning he inadvertently gave himself the gaze that brought about his own demise. Narcissus was extraordinarily beautiful, and this was, as is so often the case in the world of myth, his downfall. This time, though, it was not the dangerous eye of some other person or god that fell upon him, but his own. His beauty, when reflected back at him, becomes the accidental trigger of fascinatio, the act of seeing himself and crucially his own eyes which themselves were beautiful and potent, initiated a feedback loop. He becomes caught in a circuit of visual magic. His pining and staring at himself until he dies is an extreme but perfect description of the effects of the evil eye at work. He wastes away and dies, and on that path he loses the very thing that attracted the evil eye to him, his good looks. Another tragic mythological figure deeply connected to this dangerous world of vision, envy, and fascination is Medusa. Medusa's gaze is of course infamous for its transformative power. It turns people to stone. And this petrifying effect is what makes her an archetype of the power of vision to harm. But like Narcissus, Medusa was once beautiful, too beautiful. Her beauty first caused her to be violated by Poseidon in Athena's temple, and this in turn aroused the envy of Athena herself. As punishment, Athena turned her into a hideous gorgon with snakes in her hair, doomed to turn anyone she looked upon to stone. An envious gaze thus robs Medusa too of her beauty and happiness. However, Medusa's gaze in turn becomes a weapon, a magical emanation that causes physical harm. She represents the extreme consequences of the power of vision when it is charged with jealousy and directed towards others. Medusa is a personification of the destructive power of envy. She embodies vision as a vector for jealousy and harm. She's the victim of invidia and the evil eye, but becomes, mythologically, its most powerful expression. The hero Perseus, who eventually slew Medusa and beheaded her, kept her head in a bag as a powerful weapon which he could pull upon his enemies and turn them into stone. And for this reason, in the real world, Medusa's head with its petrifying gaze was often employed as a charm to protect against envy and injury. The idea was that the power of the gaze could be harnessed. You could ward off invidious eyes by employing protective symbols that turned that gaze back upon the aggressor. And that idea of averting or turning away the harmful gaze is called apotropeism. It means turning away, and apotropaic images and objects are literally meant to turn away the evil eye, to reflect it back upon its source. Apotropaic charms, amulets, images, and symbols are what I was describing at the start of this episode as we entered the Roman home. domestic mosaics and frescoes, especially those placed at thresholds or in public-facing spaces of the Roman home, are key material sites where the dynamics of invidia and fascinatio were ritually and aesthetically negotiated. The Roman home was certainly a stage for elite display, and the Roman atrium-style house was architecturally designed for controlled visibility. It was organized so that the house offered axial sightlines from street to garden, and so guests, clients, strangers, rivals, entered and saw, and they were meant to. But this visibility might invoke both admiration and envy, and so the dynamic at play in miniature and elite homes is a microcosm of the same complicated dynamic of invidia at large in Roman society. And Roman society was one of intense competitive display. Glory must be seen to exist. Honor was won by surpassing others, and public life was a theatre of virtue on display. Triumphs, orations, funerals, buildings, games. But in this world, visibility was always double-edged. To be seen was to be admired, but also to be envied. And just as the myths warn, the very qualities that elevate an individual, nobility, martial prowess, fortune, beauty, also attract hostile eyes. Invidia becomes a shadow cast by glory. The dilemma then is that the pursuit of glory depends on being seen, but being seen is inherently perilous. So in the house, as in society at large, on the one hand there was a drive to impress and to elevate, but on the other there was a need to deflect and protect. Hence the visual logic of invidia and the magical, superstitious interventions that arise from it. Representations of Narcissus or Medusa were meant to engage with and contain the potentially harmful gaze of envious onlookers. They were images that mirrored back to the viewer the very harm that viewing might inflict. They were perceptual traps, carefully calibrated to both display and ward off. Some mosaics depicted the eye itself under attack from everything from scorpions to pitchforks. The prominence of mirrors doubled sight back upon itself and called for self-reflection, just as the taste for optical illusions blurred and confused surface and depth, and it created an aesthetic of instability, tricking the eye and cautioning against trusting what you see. These are all expressions of a world in which being loved, being excellent, being fortunate, and most of all being seen, made a person vulnerable. Particularly characteristic of Roman society, and an endless source of amusement for modern visitors to museums, is the role of phallic imagery in all of this. And unfortunately, YouTube wants to protect your innocence, and so I can't show you images here without swiftly having my account shut down. But no doubt you've seen the proliferation of images of erect phalluses wherever Romans have passed through. It was normal to hang them at thresholds, and anywhere and on anyone felt to be at risk. And as I said, they were hung around the necks of children because children were thought to be particularly vulnerable and helpless. The phallus was a powerful image, thought to discombobulate the evil eye, distract invidia, and to stop her in her tracks. It was called a fascinum in Latin, also from the same root, fascinare, to bewitch or to draw the evil eye. And you may recall that during the exorcism that I described in the previous episode, the father of the household had to avert his eyes and to tiptoe through the house, making the sign of the manos ficus, the fig hand, which is an obscene phallic gesture. It's the same matrix of beliefs and rituals here. The image, sign, or gesture generally diffused whatever ill forces might otherwise be gathering. And they were often humorous because laughter really is the best remedy and just about the best deflection there is. So you may have seen, for example, hanging bronze figurine lamps with phalluses so enormous they've turned into panthers, and the man to whom it belongs is being attacked by it and is left trying to stab it down with a sword. You may also have seen the famous fresco of the well-endowed god Priapus, who I mentioned earlier, weighing his giant manhood on a scale as you enter a house in Pompeii. Fertility, fecundity, and apotropaic humour and aversion are all part of the display and function here. Invidia thus gave her own particular flavour, not only to the religion of the Roman home, but to the very design and ornamentation of the house itself. This is not the orderly worship of domestic altars or ritual care for the ancestors, but nevertheless the desire to ward her off is arguably the most conspicuous concern of a belief system that ran so deep it manifested everywhere, not just in the home, but in Roman society at large. Invidia thus takes us out of the Roman home, through those doorways and thresholds painted with gorgons and jingling with phallic charms, and back out into the streets of the city, where she's just as conspicuous in the widespread amulets and imagery that aim to ward her off. In our exploration of Roman religion and its teeming pantheon of deities who have fallen into the shadow of the more famous gods and who have been obscured by the veil of Greek mythology, Invidia and the dangerous world of fascination must be extricated from any conflation with Nemesis and given a spotlight of her own. While she's not a deity, she seeps into the very colour of daily life and the religious behaviour of the city. Her poisonous enchantments required no personification, temple or cult, but her presence was ubiquitous, and it must be said, taken seriously enough within the realm of official religion. One example will suffice here because its prestige will illustrate its gravity. Before a Roman triumph, when a victorious general with a face painted red rode his chariot through the city in emulation of Jupiter to the praise of the cheering crowds, solemn precautions were taken. As you can imagine, this kind of elevation and excessive praise was an open invitation to Invidia. Being the focal point of all those many, many eyes in the crowd was sure to attract and inflict invidious gazes upon the general, so that his moment of triumph could also mark the hour of his downfall. And so to guard against this, the most sacred priestesses in Rome were called upon to take control. The Vestal Virgins themselves prepared the chariot that would draw so much attention. And how do you suppose they guarded its rider against the ravages of Invidia? What solemn ritual did they perform? What do you imagine Rome's immaculate virgins did? Did you guess? Well, they hung a great big dangling phallus beneath the chariot, of course. And on that bombshell I shall leave you in the streets of Rome until next time. Goodbye, and here's looking at you.